Here, you can write, if you want to write things,
Yeah?
you can write on here, for example, like that,
Okay.
you see?
I like that signifier. Yeah. Good, thank you. Okay. So, yeah, maybe, yeah, so, again, we're still in the analytic with Ricoeur. And part of the analytic involves the interpretation of dreams. But I wanted to go to something that I think is very, very important for his reading. On page 194, beginning on 194, all the way to 196, because he has a nice move on the metapsychology of Freud here. Or maybe we could really begin on page 190, 193. And this is about the universal character of the incestuous impulse is confirmed by the sudden discovery that all men share the destiny of Oedipus. And that common destiny is in turn confirmed by the profound and universal power of the legend itself. So again, you know, Oedipus has structure and the triangulation of daddy, mommy, me, if you will, is still, for Ricoeur, is dominant in Freud. And I mention this because, you know, I will talk later after we do some Lacan about the anti-Oedipus movement. I'm sorry. So, I mean, the legend itself, and I want to mention one very, very good book on this that came out of the period after Ricoeur wrote this book and was influenced both by Lacan and a very serious reading of Freud. It's called The Legend of Freud by Sam Weber, W-E-B-E-R. A book very accessible, worth reading, but also very dense. Okay, so just an interesting footnote here. That Weber's work is one of the best books on the legend of Freud and the legend of Oedipus, and its, you know, and the myth, the structure, and the ongoing legend as a universal in Freud. Of course, this is taken apart by the Guattari Deleuze moment, even though it's both for and against Oedipus. If you read the book carefully, there's an ambiguity in that, you know. Okay, so anyway, the myth, of course, is reduced to a dream fantasy in Freud, but this fantasy is universal, for it springs from primeval dream material. So again, Oedipus has universal structure, which is also the Levi-Strauss reading in structural anthropology. Oedipus is a universal myth that you can read into every culture. It's been taken up by people, you know, in many ways. Yes, there's a lot of argument about this, but I want you to know that this is where Ricoeur's reading of Freud and Freud himself is coming from. Therefore, the complex will forever bear the name of the myth, even when psychoanalysts explain the myth by the oniric fantasy, the dream, the myth alone is what immediately stamps the dream as typical. Okay? So this is part of his reading of Freud. Okay, he's going to make a move that's interesting here. The 3 essays on the theory of sexuality are an important step towards the strictly psychological interpretation of the Oedipus complex. So try to go away. As all the later theses concerning the role of Oedipus complex in the establishment of the superego presuppose the existence of the infantile sexuality. And again, a crucial text not read, because Ricoeur is actually arguing here alongside, I think, of the more intelligent Freudians, if you will, or the more creative ones, against the Neo-Freudians who downplay libido, downplay, you know, the aspect of the infantile sexuality, very much so. And this would be, you know, the Neo-Freudians, and also obviously Adler and Jung in another way, which we talked about last week. All right. Anyway, hence the immense importance of the 3 essays. Precisely, the 3 essays supply the interpretation of the Oedipus complex with 2 basic themes. One is the structure, and he emphasizes structure, of infantile sexuality and that of its history or its phases. He does not say its stages, its phases. Okay, more than this, or that particular thesis concerning the sexual aberrations, infantile sexuality, or the transformations of puberty, the three titles of the three essays, what this short book essentially intended to show is the work of prehistory. Okay? Again, a Marxist term, as we know as well. In man's sexual history, a prehistory obliterated, as it were, by careful amnesia, to which we shall return later. And that amnesia will be part of the Neo-Freudian movement, in a historical, practical sense, and the practices of the 1950s and forward. Once the interdict barring us from access to infantile sexuality has been raised, great and terrible truths rise up. The objects and names with which we are acquainted in a state of culture are secondary functions of a much broader tendency capable of every sort of transgression and perversion. A disconnected bundle, and I'll substitute drives, including cruelty, is ever on the verge of coming undone, with the resultant formation of neurosis as the negative of perversion. Right? Civilization is built up at the expense of the sexual instincts, and this is elementary civilization and its discontents in the first two chapters of The Future of an Illusion and the metapsychological works. Through the restriction of their use and in reaction against the threat of their potential perversity. In this period, Freud uses the general term sublimation to cover the diversion of sexual forces from their aims to new aims that are socially useful. So we have this movement from polymorphous perversity to that of socially useful, quote unquote, sublimation. Right? This transformation. You're frowning. You don't like that.
No, but the whole structure rides on sublimation, which is a conservative reading of sexuality, right?
Why would it be a conservative reading? It would be that society itself needs the sublimation in order to go. But the conservative, the other aspect would be, was it first of all subversive to think of us in terms of polymorphous, perverse creatures, right? I mean, the sublimation is something that's necessary for civilization.
You must
according
rein
to
in
Freud.
your desires in order for sublimation and therefore civilization to exist.
Sublimation itself is the work work versus that of quote unquote libidinal, I mean, it's the putting to work of libidinal energies.
But
right?
you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do, but I mean, I kind of do, but I'm just wondering why you use the term conservative, because Freud's building here a theory, right, and a structure, and Ricoeur's commenting on it, that something that's left out is this theory of infantile sexuality.
I'm not saying that about Ricoeur, I'm saying that about Freud.
Okay, but I mean, he's trying to defend Freud, if you will, against the Neo-Freudians, which go the way much further about sublimation and also taking out the more polymorphous, perverse aspects of what Freud's discovering in the prehistory. I mean, the subversive aspect to me here is the prehistory. It's like taking Pasolini just makes a movie. We don't really see what's going on behind that movie and what drives are really pushing it, in a sense. I mean, that's what I think is, the
movie is sublimation.
Yes, the film is for sublimation, right? But
No matter how perverse.
Yes, no, that's true. Yeah.
I
Okay.
concede.
Okay, I'm not trying to, I mean, I just wonder, I mean, I think Freud's a radical conservative, but at the same time, I think he's, radical in the sense that he's, this diving into this dredging up of this prehistory is very important, and something that becomes not only diluted, but really neutralized in the name of a kind of political conformity and a political conservatism. This is where I'm trying to go with this. And I think Ricoeur doesn't say this directly, but I think he hints at it, in some ways. Yeah? So that's where I'm trying to, remain faithful to the text, if you will, as Ricoeur, right? He's doing it through a kind of hermeneutic, and he's looking at multiple texts that are written around a theme, right? And the theme is really that of what is the relationship of infantile sexuality and perversion to that of society, and what are we capable of doing in society? The term psychopath, and I reread last weekend, or actually Monday of this week, Linder's book, Rebel with a Cause, which I recommend, which Richard Linder in 1944 wrote a book called Rebel with a Cause about criminals, right? And the use of hypnotherapy with these criminals. What he's really talking about is the notion of the psychopath and the sociopath, right? In terms of how these terms are made and what these people are really experiencing in terms of transgression vis-a-vis the system. And he presents many case studies. I don't know if you know Richard Linder. He also wrote The 50 Men. He was a left-leaning psychoanalyst, right? And who treated many people that were in the government during the McCarthy period. He was based out of Maryland, it's interesting to watch the proceedings of Baltimore Washington Psychoanalytic Society, because a lot of their patients are working in, State Department, Defense Department, et cetera, et cetera. So Linder was in that mix. He died an untimely, early in his life, I think in his 50s. But he wrote a book called The 50-Minute Hour, which I recommend. Very dialectical thinker. But anyway, he's looking at this kind of prehistory too, in terms of transgression, right? In many ways. So, the real issue, at least to me, is we get these terms: sociopath, psychopath, anti-hero, right? Maladjusted, deviant. All of this vocabulary comes out of a certain moment of polymorphic perversity that becomes very judgmental as terms, right? They become clinical terms that then are used in terms of you're antisocial, right? You're not conforming, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm looking at this on at least a dual register. One, the text itself, the theory itself, and then how it's taken up, and then how it applies, if you will, or how you orient this to certain historical movements. So Linder's writing this, he's doing the study, in the 1940s, and then in the 1950s during the McCarthy era. So you have all this happening at this point, right? As well as the schools of acculturation and the Neo-Freudian movement, which will, those of you that stay for the Age of Anxiety, we're reading one of those people who are considered part of the Neo-Freudian movement, Erich Fromm, whose last name in German, by the way, means Erich Devote, the devotee. The Fromm is an adjective in German for devote. Anyway, so I don't know. Listen, I'm trying to work with this. Deleuze and Guattari, for those of you who have any familiarity with the Anti-Oedipus, which was, a collaboration between Deleuze, the philosopher, and Guattari, the militant analyst, are really trying to, destructure Oedipus, right, into something else, a kind of Reichian move, right, in terms of energy and matter in a different way. But the energetics in Freud, since we went through that last week, too, the project for a scientific project, is really, in a way, we're really talking about a denial of really, in some ways, the id, or the unconscious, in such a way in terms of its subversive potential, right? Instead, this is used as almost a judgmental thing of conformity. Hence, you get theaters. You get theater of the absurd. I'm trying to read this socially as well. You get the theater of the absurd. You get Ionesco's rhinoceros, right, which is part of a structure of conformity. Everybody becomes a rhinoceros. You see the conformity taking place in all these movements we have today. I've got to join the bandwagon. I've got to do this. You could use this as a critique. How does this conformist logic take place? And Freud was anything but, in my estimation, a conformist, right? I'm not trying to defend him against all, things. The predicate here, the material predicate, once again, is that the Oedipus structure, legend, myth, and structure are universal to Freud, right? Hence, you had books. The people that studied in Africa, Edmond Orteguez, if you're interested in this too, wrote a book called African Oedipus, trying to show the difference of, obedience, Edward Orteguez' African Oedipus, right? Which was, a kind of continuation of Fanon's work from Black Skin, White Masks, and the lived experience of the black. By the way, Fanon's about 700 pages that just came out on his clinical writings that are now in English. They've been in French for about a year, so it's a fast translation, which is good. So all his clinical studies and the colonized subject is now out. But anyway, to go back to this, and I'm glad you say this, because in a way, yes, Freud is very conservative vis-a-vis politics. He does not believe in the transformation of, human nature, if you will. He's not an adherent to, the second nature thinking of the Lukács, or a lot of Marxists. He really thinks that this is an ideal, communism, etc., even though he was very oriented towards free clinics and education. He was never really a partisan of the movement, right?
How much did he
Yeah.
write about the superego? Or did that come later?
Well, that's part of the topography that we looked at too last week, I think, and the week before, that you had the early systems of the unconscious, and we read the science of the unconscious, the attempt to, what psychoanalysis is, again, fundamentally is the science of the unconscious. And then that topography, part of the topographic element, Freud's geology, if you will, map of the mind, then morphed into ego, superego, and id, that triumph. Yeah.
Oh, so he did.
Yeah, he wrote a book called a little pressy, called The Ego and the Id. Right.
I know he had the ego and the id. I didn't know how much he ascribed to the superego.
Well, a lot, because in the superego is where you have a lot of the cultural formation.
Yes.
Right? This is where the value system is created in general.
That's
right?
why I asked.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. You can probably see the superego, off the top of my head, mostly in the book Group Psychology and Analysis of the Ego, or better translated, Mass Psychology and the Analysis of the I. That's the more fundamental translation. But for American purposes, the group. I think I tell you the famous story about, since we're talking about conformity, Sartre in a piece called Individualism and Conformity in the United States, written when he visited New York after the war, after World War II. He met with a group of people that had this, some big social group that was functioning. I forgot the name of it, but it was headed up by a couple of women at this time, and so sort of asked him, what happens to these so-called psychopaths or sociopaths, etc. Said, well, we have to bring them in. They're not an individual to us. You're not an individual until you join that group. So this is the American way, in some ways. You're not privileged in a group until you're, basically individualized within that group. Right? Yeah. There's no such thing as, quote, the outsider or the individual. One of the reasons, and this in literature, the anti-hero was part of the 50s and 60s, figures in fiction, right?
In literature,
yeah. In literature, right? Yeah, throughout. So the anti-hero was very much, and that, you begin to see this kind of the rebel with cause too, it comes out, right? So, no accident he called his studies Rebel with Cause, right? Rebellion with Cause. So, completely forgotten figure. His name is Linder, Richard Linder. Linderer, I think. Yeah, Richard Linder. Right. Sorry. So anyway, I don't ever, Peter didn't leave me an eraser. So, maybe tissue. But, so anyway, let me go back to this. The point here is the suppression, if you will, of the 3 essays on infantile sexuality, right? So, okay, the whole network of ideas is the background for the specific psychology. So he's not talking about this as a cultural moment, it's the psychology of the Oedipus Complex. In fact, there is no discussion of the Oedipus Complex which does not sooner or later touch upon the group of themes in the 3 essays. That is the existence of infantile sexuality, its polymorphous structure, its disposition to perversion, and infantile incest presupposed by the Oedipus complex is only a particular instance of the general theme. Right? But the interpretation is also indebted of the Oedipus complex for the first detailed elaboration of the theme of the stages or the organization. I like organization much better, of the libido, a genetic theme which is the indispensable complement to the structural theme. It is true that the differentiation state not carried out very far in the second essay. And then he goes on, still recognizes only two pre-genital organizations, that is the oral and the sadistic anal organization. But the fundamental distinction between the sexual and the genital is established not only in its structural significance, in the building of the theory, but also in its historical elaboration. This distinction is at the fundamental condition of all the subsequent analysis. So he's dating, in some ways, 1923 as a term, pretty much in libido. In the following editions, to modify his account by relating the Oedipus complex to another pre-genital organization, the phallic stage, hence to a stage posterior to autoeroticism, a stage where the libido already has vis-a-vis, but where, in return, sexuality has failed through a lack of organization. Okay? To this phallic organization will be related the threat of castration, and again, this is the bedrock on which psychoanalysis rests, is castration anxiety. Not being towards death, but castration anxiety, which Freud kind of nicely talks to a Turkish, I don't know if you know the story, when he starts talking about castration, that he's speaking to a Turkish gentleman who says, this is worse than death. Right? He relates this anecdote and when he talks about castration anxiety. And this is not gender specific either. Yeah? And Lacan will take this up major way as we go forward. Even the theme of identification finds support in the stages, right? Inasmuch as the prototype of this identification is the incorporation of the devouring of the oral or cannibalistic stage. And as Freud says, there are two early stages in prehistory, the cannibalistic and, of course, the murderous. Right? This is what he talks about. It's not difficult to see the importance of this brief book, valued highly for the explication of the Oedipus in Freud's thought, namely his insistence on prehistory. And this is the point here for our purposes, a theme shared by both Marx and Freud, a prehistory which has its own laws and, so to speak, its own history. Okay? The way to prehistory promotes a type of pessimism which is characteristic of Freud, and all varieties of Neo-Freudianism have tried to soften or eliminate. So again, this whole movement of Neo-Freudianism, we're much worse today. From what I'm reading about what's going on in therapy in the current, the Neo-Freudians look like Marxist Leninists, But anyway, this Neo-Freudian movement becomes the object, right, of softening Freud's and diluting its term. If you want to look at this in deeper detail and going back to the concept of sublimation, I mentioned Russell Jacoby, his best book in my opinion. It's called Social Amnesia, which is a study through the Frankfurt School's eyes and Russell's a historian at Berkeley, Russell Jacoby, Social Amnesia, how Freud's theory was diluted in the American field. And not by the ego psychologists, but more by the Neo-Freudians. So we have two major antagonists working through, quote unquote, a more, rigorous and more subversive Freud. One, the ego psychology of Hartmann, Kreis, and Lowenstein, of which is played out. You strengthen the ego for greater adaptation, sort of a kind of ability to function within the system, right? As well as, quote, realize one's potential. Maslow in some ways comes out of that in terms of the stages that he develops. Maslow was a leftist, and he sold to corporations this, what was it called? The theory of hierarchical values, right? And there were 10 steps in the hierarchical values. So Maslow's also working a little bit after Linder, and So anyway, but Jacoby is going to look at the other aspect of this, which is the Neo-Freudian movements, and criticize Horney, Harry Stack Sullivan in particular, and of course, Erich Fromm, who we're going to read later. And, and Marcuse, for those of you that have read Harrison Civilization, the appendix to that book is a long polemic with Fromm in terms of the humanistic Freud that Fromm has. And we maybe talk about that later today in the Age of Anxiety class. So anyway, so you have these two antagonists working through. So again, the task here of the hermeneutic restorativeness as a method, and also to get some meaning out of this, and Freud's real subversive and I think creative potential requires a reading of the infantile sexuality essays and bringing libidinal theory back into the fore. Right? Even though the narcissism piece is confused about libidinal object, it's a very turgid piece the more I read of it, and we'll go there. It's very, you thought so too?
Yes.
Yes, it's very turgid. Yeah, it's one of his worst writings. It's
Bad
talked about. It's really bad. He's searching for all kinds of stuff there. It's just bad writing. Okay, let me just go on with this for a second on the three. So anyway, the whole network, etc., the group of themes, the existence of infantile sexuality. So first of all, we have to presuppose that playing house isn't just an innocuous childhood, activity, right? It's filled with, the sexualization of children. Its polymorphous structure, how perverse it can be, right? And then its disposition to perversion. Infantile incest is only a particular instance of this, right? Okay? And anyway, let me go back over here to the weight of prehistory, right? We have already seen that in different forms, the indestructibility of wishes in the interpretation of dreams. And I want to point out that the third part of the chapter 7 is on wish and wish fulfillment in the interpretation of dreams. So today I'm trying to somewhat catch us up a little bit through some interrelatedness or intertexts of Freud, right? So the timelessness of the unconscious, right? So the unconscious knows no time. It's not being as time. It's being as timelessness. Well, ultimately, the unconscious knows no time. Yeah, in a way. This is the working presupposition of the science of the unconscious. We're really studying what constitutes time. In a way, he asks a radical question like Heidegger: what is time? In many ways, and this seems to be another aspect. The unconscious knows no time. So the only time we can know is maybe pre-conscious through the image formation, and of course consciousness. Right? And then you can go through. There's no such thing as linear time. That's just very one, or sequential time, or these kind of things. So this is very much in relation to the breakthroughs in the thinking and science of time at this point, and as well as very well the experiments in temporality in literature. Joyce, for example, you take the work of 20 years, right, the Odyssey, and you reduce it to one day and an average man walking through the streets of Dublin, and all it is the consciousness of this one person. So
or the history of man in Finnegan's Wake.
Yes.
River Run past
Adam and Eve, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, which has
way.
been studied. Those of you that are interested in this, Joyce was studied very actively in the 70s by Lacan and the school. They did many commentaries on James Joyce. Of course, you have Proust.
Oh yes.
The remembrance of the search of lost time, in a way in which we begin to see other kinds of experiments of time, which are Bergsonian and Freudian in movement. Then you begin to see breakup of temporal structures in the novel and in poetry, as you know, with the experiments of Pound, Cummings, etc. And then you have, of course, more and more work of fiction that begins this kind of The Sound and the Fury. The first 50 pages of The Sound and the Fury is life is a tale told full of sound and fury by an idiot. Told by an idiot, it's through an idiot's consciousness that we get Benji.
Faulkner also said Christ wasn't crucified, he was killed by the ticking of 100 clocks.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Faulkner is one of the great metaphysicians of our time as a novelist. Yeah, I think. in a way. So you have all these kind of experiments, again, to historicize this and show you a lot of the interconnections. And Freud, I always adhere, if you will, to Freud's maxim that before the poets, we must lay down our arms. And you see this in Freud's writing all the time, where he'll quote the poets when he feels a little bit on shaky ground, etc. Okay, so let's go on. The soften or limited, we've seen it, etc. The 3 essays, the original deviation of sexuality, deviation as to the object. So when you begin to get these manuals like DSM-5, I think it is now, or working on 6, these are really meaningless categories, except to, insurance agency and maybe guiding initial diagnostic categories, because, Freud's really a dangerous deviant himself, in the history of psychology. Psychoanalysis itself was based on, a kind of deviancy of how we thought about ourselves. In a way. He has dared to go where, nobody wants to go. He says, that's where I'm going to do. I go where nobody goes, and into this unconscious region. So in his conclusion, he says, a disposition to perversions is an original and universal disposition of the human sexual drive. Right? Normal sexual behavior is developed, and this is crucial. You begin to see normal pathological, normal perverse at work here in terms of this dialectical tension that, again, Canguilhan's great book, The Normal and the Pathological, takes, obviously it's cute from this, right, when he looks at paradigms of normality and pathological paradigms. Developed out of it as a result of organic changes and psychical inhibitions occurring in the course of maturation. Okay? So to say you're normal is a bad thing to a Freudian, or to, I guess, to a Freudo-Marxist, or to, one who considers the masters of suspicion seriously, Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, what I consider the modern trinity of modern consciousness. I don't know how we can really deviate from that at this point. There have been attempts, but there's still the structure on which we sit. If you want to read this as part of it, and this is an interpretive move, hermeneutical move, if you will, being as value, Marx, being as power, Nietzsche, Freud, being as desire. And you can really think of that in terms of an ontology, if you like that kind of sense. So you have being as value. What is Marx's question? What is value? Really, this is really where he is going. Right? The movement from exchange and use value into what is money, what is time and money, what is the transformation of money into capital, etc. What does it mean to originally accumulate, the historical questions, right, etc. And all described within a particular historical moment. And then, of course, with Freud, the desire. You go to the analyst, you say, what do you want? You say, but that's not what you really want, right? It seems to be one of the real, tendencies of the narrative there. Okay, so anyway, thus human sexuality is subject, right, Ricoeur, and I think that's very, very important for our purposes, because we live in an era where, my understanding, statistically speaking, it's almost 50% of the internet hits are pornography. At this point, what is going on in this kind of new mediation? What does it say about us? What is it really, symptomatic of? And maybe we can look at this in terms of a different kind of perversity. And, and also the left has really always eliminated libidinal economy, most of the left. It's all about, victimhood, exploitation, terrible workplace, etc. But it's never really, except for the Frankfurt School's investigations and a few people that came from Europe over here, very few people have really engaged psychoanalytic, theory or the question of desire. We have some of that, in the 60s and early 70s, but not as a continuation. And hence why cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, all of these replacements for psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic directed psychotherapy, are operative now, today. This is what we're getting. And this collective thing of, go to this group or that group, etc. Yeah. Anyway, is a seat of a debate analogous to the one the sophists, and this is for Ricoeur as philosopher, page 196, inaugurated concerning language. And this is one of the great Platonic dialogues of the sophist. Language, the debate between physis and nomos. Physis, of course, being nature, nomos, of course, being the law, convention, etc. This is a fundamental moment in Greek philosophy. Physis, nature, that which emerges, versus that of nomos, what becomes the convention. And this dialectic plays out throughout history, and this is what the sophists do. Like language, human sexuality is the result of institution as much as nature. And again, something we have to really think about. The theme of perversion, which is sometimes being looked upon as a carryover from middle-class morality, is there to remind us that by nature the libido holds in reserve all the infractions, and this is Nietzsche, obviously, second essay of the genealogy of morals, of ordinary morality. Genital union is always a victory over the libidinal's original dispersion towards zones, aims, and this, again, aims, and objects regarded as deviation from the mainstream of genital heterogeneity. Right? Perverts and neuropaths are the human evidence of the original aberration of human sexuality. Fixation and regression to earlier stages are specifically human possibilities inscribed in the structure and the history of this prehistory. Try to read this way. This is, of course, complete speculation on my part, but think about the 80s and the advent of Reagan, Thatcher, and Reaganism. What begins to happen? We begin to become foodies. Everything becomes around this kind of food regression. America's getting into training. You know, everybody starts to, you know, you have the cooking shows. It begins with, you know, post Julia Child, right? Now everybody gets into the cooking channels on the cable news. You know, everybody's got to be good in the kitchen. The men have to be good in the kitchen, etc. So in some ways you could look at sometimes these reactions or political reactionaryism in terms of, you know, the oral, you know, genital and, you know, anal fixations in a certain way. So we're maybe living through, you know, in a different way, this kind of, you know, continuation of an oral, you know, a fixation or oral regression. I'm not sure, but I mean, it's just a speculation on my part, you know, psychologically speaking, or looking at this move of the last, you know, we've been literally, you know, the left has been, we've been in a counter-revolutionary moment, if you date, you know, a culmination of revolutionary activity in May of '68 over 50 years, and maybe in the U.S., you know, certainly since the advent of the, you know, quote-unquote Reaganism, Thatcherism, a new kind of military Keynesianism as an economic system, and the Tina syndrome, right? I mean, if you think about it. So we've been in this counter-revolutionary moment for a very long time, and maybe this psychoanalysis, whether we take it the direction of restorative hermeneutics or Stiegler does, that we're lacking, you know, we have to go further back than the primordial narcissism. We have to go back to Kantian auto-affection. Nobody likes themselves anymore, you know, in a sense that the narcissism is you know, happening in digitalization in an everyday sense. It's mirrored. The new cave is the screen, you know, and screen memories are literal screens now, no longer, you know, this externalization of memory into the screen, into data.
What you have is the
I'm listening,
complete victory of nomos over physis, completely going on with this mad actions against abortion, the total rejection of the body, the total madness of nomos making laws that deny logic.
Right. No, I agree. Yeah.
It's
Although nomos is needed for the left, you need a nomos. You need convention and law in order to keep regulation going somewhat.
Well, the right has
because you can't,
nomos.
You know. I'm sorry.
The right has totally captured nomos. Where's nomos
Yes,
on
the
the
right
left?
has captured discourse and nomos. Yes, absolutely.
And gone stark raving mad with it.
Yes, that's another way of looking at it. The last 45 years, it's stark raving mad, or 48 years now. 49. Thank you so much, Ronnie. Okay. We owe you a box of Kleenex. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. I mean, again, what's of interest for us here is taking some of this theory and looking at where we are. I read a very little good book. I recommend it. I don't know if it's available online, but it's called Emotions at Work, and it's basically about how capital now uses emotions as basically profited this. Her name is Nicole, I think it's Brenoff. It's from Minor Composition Series, which is part of the Autonomedia project, in Williamsburg, Jim Fleming's group. But it's called Emotions at Work, and her name is Nicole Brozoff. I'll have it next week. I think it's Brozoff. But anyway, how emotions, emotional work is being capitalized upon, et cetera. How cognitive capitalism, if you will, has now capitalized the emotions. How affect is now being used in terms of whole new industries, and we're unaware of how much in a certain way. Yeah, tapping to go. Capitalism has made us so stupid we don't even know how to sleep anymore. To look at the dream book and the level of the dreams there versus what I hear people are dreaming about today. It's like, where are we going? You talk about massive regression. Yeah, in some ways. So you have to think about that. And the great phrase of Leonard Cohen, the rich have their stations, cable stations in the bedrooms of the poor. So what's being fed, to go back to your thing about Fusus nomos, right, in Ricoeur's thing, that's a classic philosophical opposition.
It's only for the poor and the middle class who are being subjected to this, not the rich.
Yeah. This is where Chomsky could have been of value. He could have had his group studying not only linguistic codes and how this is shifted in major newspapers and how people are conditioned everyday life by reading what's going on in generative and transformative grammar in everyday life, by reading the New York Times, by reading these word salads, so to speak, that we're getting in everyday life, right? And also thinking this through in terms of what politics would be there, kind of the politics of linguistic, intervention, and what we could understand.
Reproductive labor.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. You seem to be really on that theme today, huh? Yeah.
Well, you want to bring Marx into it.
No, that's good. No, I was thinking of abortion and other things.
It's Freudian in the sense of denial of desire, but it's also Marx forced reproductive labor, free reproductive labor. Sure.
Well, emotions at work, you don't know how much you're really working. We've forgotten how to sleep. People don't know how to go to sleep anymore. They're on the gadgets late at night. Think about what this is doing.
Sleep. I haven't slept in days.
Okay, well, we keep talking, Chris. We're talking about deviations here. Anyway.
Am I dreaming this?
You're dreaming. You may be. Yeah, you may be. That's a Cartesian question. That's Descartes at work, right there. Yeah. He was not stupid. Am I awake or am I asleep here? And that depends on if it's representational or. Yeah. All right. So anyway, by the way, Freud would not touch Descartes' three dreams. He would not do an interpretation on the three dreams that he reproduces somewhat in the Discourse on the Method, when he's in the solitary room in the famous stove-heated room. Yeah, where Foucault and Derrida begin their great debate on madness and civilization. Is Descartes mad? Is it a moment of madness? Is the moment of decision a matter, which means to cut, really? To be decisive means to cut. Is that a moment of madness? Vis-a-vis. And the Philosopher's City, which is interesting too in terms of the longer narrative since the sophists has come up, is really about the movement of reason and madness. That's really what it's about. You're denied entry into the philosophical city, if you will, if you don't have reason. Madness is excluded. Even though, nothing but madness in philosophy, in so many ways. So, and this goes back to Plato. This goes back to, Aristotle on the soul, etc. Yeah, and this is a very interesting theme. So a lot of this stuff we read in the contemporary stuff has a very long background, that goes way back. The Sophist is one of the great pieces written of literature in philosophy, as a dialogue. It's pretty magnificent. And Foucault is really, in some ways, one of the best readers of this in terms of sophistry and dialectic. On the other side, what a sophist is? Everybody knows the historical background. The sophists were itinerant philosophers who would sell lessons to the rich kids. They would go around to the rich kids' families and say, "We can make your son or daughter," mainly son. Can make you much better speakers. Well, today they go to the daughters too, as we see in the presidential Democratic race. But anyway, so we can make you better, in rhetoric. So the sophist does not believe, quote unquote, in argument for the truth, right? Or for revealing the truth. The sophist believes in argument for argument's sake. It's a very formal way of addressing arguments. So they became adept at that, of which this morphs into public speaking and all this kind of stuff that we have, going around today. And Bernays is expert at this. Dale Carnegie is expert at this, since most of this culture's, we forget this, most of this culture is built on the power of positive thinking. How can you sell used cars? If you're not positively, how can you even get up to go to the stupid job to do so if you don't believe in positive thinking, or you don't have that aspect going on, or not 90% of the work that's done, right? So Dale Carnegie, Mellon, all of this stuff, Carnegie Mellon, Andrew Carnegie, all these things are very important in terms of looking at education, particularly in the United States. Europe has a different kind of tradition, but certainly in the U.S., this is all part and parcel of stuff. And why Dewey appears as a radical, which he really, in my opinion, is not totally radical, but he appears as a radical in relation to what is seen at that time. So anyway, so the sophist, and the opposition to sophistry is dialectics. Dialectics is originally a conversation that is oriented towards the truth in Plato. Not as we read in Hegel and Kant, but really in the first use of the term dialectic is the art of conversation in terms of the search for the truth. So that's a very good working definition of original dialectics. Yeah, the art of conversation. Yeah, the two in conversation, reading the two, dialectos. Yeah. So anyway, let me go on with this again. So perverts and neuropaths are the human evidence of this original aberration, fixation, and regression is part of the prehistory. So institutionalization, and here we go, Chris, with sublimation, is necessarily painful, right? Yeah, so, again, right? Man is educated only by renouncing the archaic practices, by abandoning former objects and aims. Institutionalization is the counterpart of that polymorphous, perverse structure. And if you think of Marcuse again, Eros and Civilization, there's a call for polymorphous creativity at the end, right? I mean, there's a real call for that throughout that text. Again, a book written in 1955, right? During this McCarthyism, mass conformism. I mean, the more I think about it, the 50s is a pretty amazing period in terms of rebellion. Most of the real breakthroughs in jazz are happening during that period. A lot of stuff in literature, a lot of stuff in terms of rebellion.
Davis.
She's later.
Angela Davis was Marcuse's student.
Oh yeah, she was a student at in Brandeis.
She came out of that. That's
Brandeis.
the left.
Yeah, sure, yeah, among many students of Marcuse.
And she stands out.
Okay. Yeah. She stands out because of the image formation, nothing, a very interesting figure, activist and agent, and very good. She actually wrote her dissertation on transcendental freedom in Kant, on the notion of the transcendental freedom in Kant. Yeah, in that period. She actually worked with Adorno too. She went to Germany. That really, I think, started a different Angela Davis. Marcuse at Brandeis, and then she went out to the West Coast. Yeah. He gave her $5,000, that to get her in terms of her bail for when they picked her up. They come in the morning with the autobiography when they picked her up. Right. Aretha Franklin, supposedly, I learned this from some show recently, was ready to give $250,000 to the Free Angela Davis Fund. So you pick a good figure, a good student of Marcuse's. Certainly his most famous student. Yeah, anyway. All right, so capable of the adult remains subject to the infant he was, so you never can really kill the child within. Something's playing out always, right? In a sense. And this is in philosophy, this is a Heraclitean move. Heraclitus' great saying, the universe is like a child at play. What a beautiful thing worth meditating on, proposition, fragment from Heraclitus. The universe is like a child at play. Because the adult remains subject, because he can lag behind and regress, because he is capable of archaism, conflict is no mere accident, which he might be spared by his better social organization or suitable education. And this puts into question whether the left really has a program, that's going to really change things, at least from Ricoeur's reading of Freud and Freud himself. I'll just point this out. This is not just a given that since we know Freud, we have, more ammunition to build, great organizations and a great future, right? Human beings can experience entry into culture only in the mode of conflict, right? So this is, again, Althusser, after the revolution, ideology remains. There's going to be nothing but conflict and bloodletting, So in a way, this is working on the premise. Reality essentially is conflict. Polemis, this is another Greek term. It's very interesting from philosophy. Polemis is the father of all things. So this is the term that, Heraclitus uses. And this is it. The father of all things. So Josh, going back to Lukács today, the thing and the thingification, you need polemos in order to really understand it. And this is, So this is a very crucial term.
So we should change Marx being as value to being as struggle.
Yeah, maybe so, but he struggles for, that's true. He said that's when he was asked by his son-in-law, what's the meaning of existence? He gave one word back, Compton, the struggle. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and obviously Darwin, the struggle for existence, right? First, natural selection, and all of this. Yeah, so that's that certainly has Darwin, Marx, and Freud all on the same page, right?
Or Heraclitus.
Well, Heraclitus all goes back to Heraclitus. He's the father of all things. He said it. Yeah. He was also known as the obscure, was his nickname, because he would speak in, quote unquote, propositional riddles. All things are in flux. So you have both chance, conflict, always working. Yeah? So the combination in the early Marx, if you will, as a formation, is really Epicurus and Heraclitus. That's really Marx at work in terms of ancient pre-Socratic philosophy. He didn't really read Plato that carefully. He read Aristotle very carefully, especially the logic, the organ. So, okay, so let me go on. Human beings in Modicon, suffering accompanies the task of culture like fate. And another Heraclitean slogan. I'm sorry, I'm on this Heraclitean kick now. Fate is character, or character is fate. How one is as character, right? You become, it's fate. That's how your life will play out. Another Greek saying that destiny. And in the ancient world, you have to accept your flaws. You have to understand the tragic flaws and work out your destiny, or you're not really living. This is one of the lessons of Greek tragedy, right? And where does the narrative of Oedipus start? It's when he blinds himself. That's when he's able to tell his story. So you're not really seen until you're really blind, hence where we get, the movement of blindness and insight. Yeah?
Demand, that's demand.
Well, he wrote the essays, yeah, but that's based on, Greek tragedy. Yeah. I'm being very nationalistic today. Anyway, yeah, it's Demand's collection of essays, but that goes on way before Paul Demand did this, and yeah. Which is a beautiful, if you're interested in high-powered, philosophically directed literary theory, Paul Demand's book, Blindness and Insight, that that Chris just mentioned, is a wonderful companion to this. Anyway, suffering accompanies the task of goals like fate, the fate that is illustrated by the Oedipus trilogy, right? Yeah. Possibility of aberration and necessity of repression are correlative. Cultural renunciation, similar to the work of mourning, mentioned above, holds the place, occupied by fear. And this is interesting. This is really, in my opinion, again, first-rate insights by Ricoeur, right? Cultural renunciation, similar to the work of mourning, mentioned above, holds the place, accompanied by fear, in the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, which you presented on, 2 years ago. Identification with the Father will enable us shortly to pursue this comparison with the Hegelian notion of recognition. The discovery of the death drive is already in the 3 essays. The many allusions to cruelty will allow us to pursue further the comparison between Hegel and Freud. This is the somber background under which the Oedipus episodes unfolds. Now, I chose this passage because in some ways, obviously, Lacan is also very influenced by Hegel, and Freud did not, to my best of my knowledge, really read Hegel actively. I may have scanned it, known about, this master thinker, but it's really Lacan who actually read and associated himself with Hegel's. And, it's both Lacan with Hegel and Lacan contra Hegel. That he's not, both for and against. And we'll try to see this at work in 4 fundamental concepts. Ricoeur, the same place, where they're focusing both on the master, slave dialectic, or in more true to the German language, the bondsman, right? And the helper, right? Or the master and the valet.
Lordship and
bondage, yeah. And, well, that's the way it's translated, and in German it's like the helper. The Neckschaffen is the kind of helper to this. He's looking at a relationship, in my opinion, in feudal society. That's language of feudal society. That the master and helper, or the lord, his lordship, if you will. Yeah, the landlord.
I see, like
helper.
that way.
Yeah. That's. I mean, look, I'm not a stickler for this. It's not me. I mean, in some ways, but the translation sometimes elicits something.
Right.
Where historically was he trying to locate this in his head? He's really describing these feudal practices, and as I mentioned last week, and we talked a little bit about this in the Lazzarato section. We're in a new feudalism in some ways. We're in a not dialectical position. We're in a new kind of nominalism, in a way, with this thing. Witness the new vocabularies, the use of Twitter, the inability. Students cannot read more than a paragraph at this point. They can't read. I hate to say this, but really, in a way, they can cut and paste for essays at the end of the semester, and occasionally they can meet with you and sit and maybe reword a few things, and you prod them along. But really, in a way, in terms of the reading has completely been denied over all this. It's about this kind of cybernetic, almost automatic writing that comes out of cutting and pasting that they've been getting away with since high school, as they bring it to the university, and maybe even earlier. So there's no practice of really reading anymore. Forget hermeneutics, which is high-powered, just basically literal reading in some ways, reproducing the text, if you will. Yeah. Much less explication du text, giving it meaning, opening it up to a conflict, conflict of interpretations. It's not happening. Not happening. And it's not only just at LIU, which is second and third tier on a good day. It's happening at the good schools too. I talked to a lot of people. I was interviewing people to rent my apartment, and at Swarthmore, seniors, one's in political science has never read Machiavelli.
How's that possible? I don't believe
And this
it.
is an elite school. This is an elite school. How is it possible? It's possible.
believe it.
At,
I
at
can't believe
70,000 a year too, on top of it all. On top of it all. I heard you guys got a fairly good contract, huh?
Yeah, Master
Fairly.
gave us a raise.
Fairly, you got a raise,
Master
right? Yeah,
gave us a
good, good. I read the terms last night.
I think we still should have struck, but, you know.
Yeah, I agree with. Oh, you're with me. I know
Master
that. I'm
gave
with
you a
you.
raise.
I would have been out there.
Master knows his slaves.
Yeah, well, look, going back to what we were doing a little bit earlier, I mean, with Freud, it's obviously the myth of Oedipus, but on the left, it's the myth of the general strike. You have no left without the myth. The left's myth is the general strike. It really is. I mean, in terms of, the long history, if you will, forward, is this myth of the general, and nobody wants to strike anymore. And we hopefully will look at this vis-a-vis Fromm, escape from freedom. Because to me, it's the faculties that are escaping from freedom in the name of very false security. Yeah, to my mind, yeah, in a way. Because these administrations could care less about what's being taught, and they could care less, ultimately, about tenure going forward. And tenure, in a way, was always a guarantee of academic freedom, and most people don't deserve tenure because academic freedom is not being exercised by principle. The principle behind tenure was to allow, Jane or you, Jarietta or Chris, to be able to express themselves openly in terms of a dissent and a critical consciousness in the university. That is so far removed from faculty's consciousnesses at this point. It's few and far between. Yeah, coming in. Yeah, I know this all too well, and I'm sure you see it at Rutgers, which is a much better and more progressive institution than where I am, and, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think I'm embarrassed even to use a word like radicalism, but what radicalism you even find, and this is in Newark, not in New Brunswick.
Yeah, that's right.
So
You're
it
in
comes,
Newark, yeah.
comes out of the community, not out of the
Right.
the institution.
Right.
Which pushes it. But I mean, even that. I mean, one of the sort of, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I was, over the time I've been there.
Well, Freud always said, "I'm astonished to have learned." Yeah, he already knew, but he would always use that phrase. I was astonished to learn that.
When you consider that at Rutgers particularly, you had to have students take over buildings, as they did in many schools. They have an
Yes,
African
of course.
American Studies
Of course.
department. And even there, I'm sort of, I guess I shouldn't be, as I said, the conservatism there. Right, that it's really kind of not really about radicalism at
I
all.
put out to our union at the general membership meeting about 2 weeks ago, that why don't you build a movement with the students based on what they're doing in Quebec and other places around North America. You take Friday off. And I said, we can take Monday off. And you're showing solidarity with this young Swedish woman who has held herself up as an icon against climate change. What any better way of getting students involved, right? Climate change, which affects everybody, it's a universal, and that the union could support, it could build support among the students towards the next contract. Oh, that's really out of the box, Michael. Something that would have been a no-brainer 30, 40 years ago is now totally out of the box, and it's not even a radical idea. I mean, I was being soft. Instead of saying occupy the university and put education back in the hands of the educators, which should be the slogan of education or something along those lines. I'm not, put the education back, because the education is not in the hands of the educators. I mean, he would be, if Freud was alive, he would be completely baffled by all of this, or just say, this is the most massive regression that we've had, in many ways. It's very strange, very strange. You've got a population that can't read. You've got faculty that can't read.
Yeah.
I'm really saying. I'm not being facetious here. We're trying to elicit provocative. It's true. It's really true. Yeah. Much less write. They can write for quote scholarly articles where they use the jargon that reaches 20 people. I mean, this is the problem with institutionalized education at this point, and the credentializing and vocationalization of education.
And the
it's
jargon
lost
is
any
often
comfort.
the jargon is often a mask for the fact that they actually can't communicate.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
It
Exactly.
sounds erudite, but
Yeah. Well, we're going to organize
Right.
in solidarity. They have no idea what these words mean. Organization, solidarity. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Contract preparation. contract campaign with no principles at all about this kind of stuff. It's unbelievable, the level. Yeah. And then you ask, what's the new generation? What are you really transmitting here? Since in a way, I mean, part of psychoanalysis was part of transmission and hoping. I mean, Freud, even in all of his pessimism, I think had the hope of a much better future, that somehow we would be in the baby steps of science, leaving aside religion and all the delusions and illusions that we had, that somehow that releasement would free us towards a future that could be much like Kant had in 1784 when he wrote What is Enlightenment? Or Marx, maybe when he wrote with Engels, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. So a good study is how these crucial texts in the history of systems of thinking, have been now so diluted so much, or now have lacked a kind of significance or hermeneutical significance. So this is very, very important. Anyway, so the relationship of Freud and Hegel, that Ricoeur is pointing out to, will be fundamental to Lacan as well. Then he goes on to talk about totem and taboo. I find reading this very, very instructive, and very, very erudite, and there's a lot here. You don't have to agree. I mean, again, the structure of the argument in a certain way, you can maybe put that to task a little bit, but I still think that there's so much to learn from reading and this meditation on Freud, and we need more like this. So anyway, if you look at Totem and Taboo in the essay of 1921, this is on page 201, plays in this connection. Freud did not possess the theoretical concept of identification, but had to rely on, and the reason I emphasize identification is because of a narcissism is about identification. It's identification of the self-reflective image. It's also identification that does not really take into account the other, in a way. It negates this wonderful saying of, I am another. You know who said that. I'm testing how much you slept. No, I am another. Who said that in poetry?
Mallarmé.
No, the contemporary of Mallarmé, same nationality. The bad boy of the French poets.
Rimbaud?
Yes, Rimbaud. I am another.
He also said, I think I'm in hell, therefore I am.
Yes, he did. Yeah, he reduced that. Yeah. A season in hell, only for a season. It's that bad relationship with Paul Verlaine. But anyway, all right. So so let's look down here, and then rather the unwieldy idea of a reaction formation, again, and this is another crucial term in Freud, on the part of a higher psychical organization, was to see the decisive role the group psychology and analysis of the ego plays in this connection. Freud is much more concerned, secondly, with justifying the pathogenic role of the Oedipus complex in the neurosis than establishing its structuring and institutional role. This is very interesting, the pathogenic role versus the structuring and institutional role. So Freud would not like these conversation, who's the head in charge here? Who's the father figure, in the institutions. That was not his intention, in terms of organizational in institution. Ethnology plays the role of experimental verification. This is the most we can say in defense of the ethnology. It is merely an accessory scaffolding of the theory of neurosis. So, in this respect, Totem and Taboo belongs to the cycle of analogical interpretations by which we have characterized applied psychoanalysis. The pattern of the analogous is structured, or furnished really, by the structural affinity between taboo and obsessional neurosis. This is important. 4 characteristics assure the parallel. The fact that the prohibitions lack any assignable motive. 2, the fact that they are maintained by an internal necessity. 3, the fact that they are easily displaceable and that there is a risk of infection from the prohibited object. And 4, the raise to the given to the injunctions for the performance of ceremonial acts. And this is a reading of Totem and Taboo, right? But the most important part is the comparison of the analysis of emotional ambivalence. And this is where we are with almost every subject in the United States. The interpretation of taboo serves as the pattern. A taboo is both the attractive and the fearful. Both the attractive and the fearful. This emotional composition of desire and fear. So you have a different dynamic here going on. Desire and fear throws much light upon the psychology of temptation and calls to mind St. Paul, Augustine, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. Right? Taboo places us at a point where the forbidden is attractive because it is forbidden, where the law excites concupiscence. The basis of taboo is a prohibited action for performing which a strong inclination exists in the unconscious. So you can see here the transgression, right, absolutely necessary, right, here. And it's related, again, to, quote, the forbidden. From this point on, the burden of proof lies on the side of the neurosis. The phenomena of authority with which desire, and you can see how carefully he reads Freud. How is he justifying these moves, right? Which desire is confronted as presupposed without being made explicit. Dams, to use an expression, have already been imposed upon and opposed to desire. Something is dammed up. Energy is dammed up. When you say, again, when we were talking earlier today, the floodgates are opened, right? Which has already become the desire to transgress. Consequently, in the remaining explanation of taboo, Freud continues to pursue his interpretation instead of going back to its conditions and presuppositions. The interpretation spreads out to encompass the features increasingly removed from the central core of the ambivalence of the forbidden and the desire, mostly taken in, this text, the great anthropology of the Golden Bough, which was read very actively by T.S. Eliot in particular.
Fraser.
Yes, Fraser, James Fraser, right? Right. An intricate psychology or even psychopathology of taboo is worked out, whereas the properly institutional factor of prohibition is never elaborated, right? The psychopathology has far-reaching consequences. In the case of royal ceremonial, a comparison with taboo ceremonial and obsessional ceremonial reveals that excessive respect is actually a figurative way of doing what is forbidden. So a coronation ceremony, right? The Grammy Awards, all these kind of things. Very interesting the way he's positioning this. A disguised expression of hostility, and that this hostility is connected with the father complex of childhood. He's looking at, kings and queens and their coronations, heads of state, etc. Primitive peoples are the well-preserved evidence of the ambivalence of the psychic life. Anxiety ultimately points to the forces of desires and the indestructibility and insusceptibility to forces of desire, to correction, which are attributes of unconscious processes. Because he is a big child, the quote-unquote savage, and I'm sure this is a mistranslation, because sauvage really means the wild one. In English it has a negative, obviously connotation, right? Gives us a clear picture on a fantastic scale of what in our present condition we see not only a highly concealed and softened figure of the moral imperative. So again, a Nietzschean move, where do these moral imperatives come from? What are their genealogy? What is the structural genealogy work? Or in the distorted features of an obsessional neurosis, right? The obsessional neurosis. Thus, emotional ambivalence is seen to be the basis not only of taboo conscious and taboo sense of guilt, but also of the moral imperative as formalized by Freud, right? And for those of you that want to take, this further, years down the road, whatever you want to do. Anyway, Kant avec Sade, or Kant with Sade, which I think is translated as Lacan, is a very interesting study of this. How all the transgressions of the Sadean category are already in the catalog of perversions in the moral imperative of Kant. It's very interesting to see this at work. Okay, so did Freud think he explained conscience by this emotional ambivalence? Going back to your question of the superego, how is it formed? What are these cultural moments? What are this tension between the archaic, right, and the contemporary? What is this tension that the obsessional neurosis carries, right, between the fixation and the ambivalence of the object, etc. Right? So certain texts which deftly transform the analogy into real would lead us to believe so. But such ambivalence is merely the manner in which we experience certain human relations. Once given the prohibition that flows from the presence of a tie superior to desire. The father figure in the Oedipus complex, the transition from biological relations to group kinship in the totemic system, leads us back to the first phenomena of authority or institutionalization. But up to this point, and do you guys know the story that Freud gives of the origin of the father? You want to say it? Yeah.
Well, the father is laden with all the sins of the group, and he's killed by the group, and that creates cohesion.
The son's killing.
Well,
not the group only.
All of all of them, and
the beginning of the brotherhood, early mafia.
It creates a kinship that shared guilt.
Right.
It creates a bonding, and that guilt and bonding creates a society.
Where does the law come from in that? Do you remember how the law is built? What is the law built upon?
Guilt.
But the guilt of what? And what is prohibited?
Murder.
What is ultimately prohibited? No, what's prohibited is incest.
And mother.
Right?
Incest
the father controls all, incest. Sisters too. Right? So this was the beginning of the kinship system in which women become the sign of exchange. Mm-hmm. Women have no right to exist except as signs of exchange. This is very, very interesting theory about how kinship relations and how patriarchy controlled for so long, in this more prehistorical and in this transformative thing. Yeah. So incest became the beginning of the law against incest. Mm-hmm. That's the beginning of the law. Not the tables coming from the bush.
Mountain.
Right? Anyway, I'm not going to, or the mountain, right? You can think of that in many terms. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, but anyway, but in terms of polymorphous perversity, you can think through this any way you'd like. But anyway, since we're on quote YouTube, so to speak. Anyway, whatever. Going back to this, but well done. The father controls everything. The brothers get together to slay the father, and then what do they recognize is important here in terms of symbolic representation. Do you remember that part of this?
You told him.
Yes, he becomes more powerful as a dead father than he was as a live father. Mm-hmm. And this is the reason for the prohibition against incest, right? So the killing of the father actually becomes more powerful as an icon. And we were talking last week about, when I was talking about the real second death in psychoanalysis is not understanding the Oedipus or Electra complex. That's one of the deaths, right? In terms of one must undergo, for a quote successful resolution of the conflict. The real death is the killing of the wonderful child in you, right? You're not so goddamn wonderful, and this is really the whole thing about narcissism. In a certain way, you begin to break down. Okay, I'm not really that wonderful child that they doted upon, and isn't he cute, etc. And a great fictional, illustration of this is Sartre's classic, very beautiful short story called Childhood of a Leader, in which he expresses in some ways how the fascist personality was developed. The childhood of a leader. Mm-hmm. Very, very astute psychologist. Sartre's not a psychoanalyst, but he took so many tools from Freud and used them in, I thought, a very, very creative way, the existential psychoanalytic method, that looks at choice, etc. So the wonderful child in me is broken, is the second part, which is the hardest death of all, because we all have these desires, going back to infantile sexuality, that are very important to understand and to have, broken, to bring us to somewhat to the reality of the situation, which is really probably the most liberating moment, because no longer do you live out in terms of just fantasy gratification. You're not living out a life of illusion, or in some other people's cases, a lot of delusions that are pretty clear out here. Or a static, really in a way, the more I look at this, the more people know, the more delusional they become. it's really interesting. The more information there is out there, the more people misunderstand in some ways. It's not really information for enlightenment purposes. It's really, really kind of interesting the way this paradox is going on in terms of how this, you talked earlier about reproduction, how the system is able to reproduce itself through quote unquote fake news on the one hand, right? And informational flow, how that critical faculty is broken down completely by most people in the United States. Then the people that use the term or criticize fake news don't know what real news is, right? In a sense. So we're in this really very strange place of where, you know, nobody can really think or sort, you know, begin the sorting out process that, you know, is part and parcel of having a healthy, vital life. You know, instead we're just over-inundated with this and we react, right? We don't really think it through. We don't really say, you know, it's going. And this is part of, again, a byproduct of everything is in the machine now. You know, everything is in the machine. This is where all the access is, in a sense. We don't have, I have a group, you know, we tentatively call it the politics of memory. And, you know, it's disbanded for a little while, but it's going to pick up again in the fall. Anyway, you know, memory, you know, is very, very important at this point. You know, interiorization, anonemic, you know, activity is absolutely crucial. And it's crucial for Freud. Remembering, repetition, and working through is absolutely crucial for any kind of successful therapeutic or for any kind of therapeutic community. And for me, my interest is really building, how do you build a society of care? Or how do you build a left that privileges care at its foremost? And I don't mean only just care for each other and our bodies and our, you know, well-being and life, but care in terms of reading, thinking, all of these aspects. How do you create this kind of community, you know, in a sense? Because what would the project be? That we get more material goods? You know, I mean, really, in a way. This is Kozhev's complaint about the United States. Oh yeah, they got communism there. Everybody's got a mall to go to. Everybody can stuff their face forever. Look at the proliferation of consumer goods, you know, in a sense. So what do we really offer in terms of a future? I mean, this is a real question. You know, I know the left forum, I'm not going to say they're stupid, but anyway, yeah, they're not, you know, what is there left to be done? Well, I mean, everything, you know, in a sense. It's not, you know, what is left to be done. I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, the play on Lenin here, I mean, we're not even at first base. Much, you know, we're maybe even halfway down the line because of Trump. We have one big object to throw darts at, you know, as usual. But the system's very good at this. Think about this too, in terms of object and aim and object choice and libidinal theory. You had George Bush, you had W all those years. Okay, so you got Obama. Was that really much better? I mean, in a way, yes, okay. A breath of fresh air, at least in terms of articulation and, you know, image that's projected to the world. But in terms of policy, no. In fact, an acceleration on targeted assassinations. Basically the financial crisis was solved by the people that brought it to you, and it hasn't been solved, right, etc. You know, he's now on the speaking circuit, you know, the usual, you know, kind of stuff. You know, I know I'm being cynical, but it's true. Anyway, so, you know, now we have Trump. But is this really, you know, our, you know, what we're good at? Is this all we have? You know? And that AOC and Bernie Sanders are going to help us out, you know, into the future? Yeah, I'm not, you know, not convinced of this. Yeah. So unless we really think, I mean, I'm speaking generically, you know, in the sense that, you know, in process, since everybody here is obviously concerned with what's going to happen to the left and the left's history, et cetera, which is certainly very dear, I think, to everybody in this room, and it's worth, you know, the moment of salvage, and, you know, to use Seymour's term in terms of their magazine, what can we really retain, and then what can we really offer out there that's different? I mean, is it just getting bigger pieces? This is the problem I always had with the 1%, 99%. Even though it raised some consciousness about what's going on. I mean, this was elementary from the 1950s going on. It took 70-something years to get this to the popular culture, that there's a 1%. I mean, you know, or half of 1% or a quarter of a percent. Even Frank Gifford, when they started to promote Monday Night Football, yes, Virginia, there is a they, used to preface the statements about this. I remember this vividly. He would go on the air, yes, Virginia, which was a kind of slur towards women, you know, yes, there is a they out there that run things. It is a dictatorship of the they, to use Heideggerian language, you know, in a sense. So, I mean, I think it's very important we have this, you know, first and foremost in our net. What are we selling? We have no money to sell. We have very few weapons, except weapons of criticism and criticism of weapons. You know, what would be a program? Yeah. And look at the best programs out there right now. Before Congress, the Green New Deal, which says nothing about the destruction of the fossil fuel industry, you know, right? And maybe getting those people jobs somewhere and educating them. Maybe we can go to solar, you know, or, you know, wind power, water power in a different way, and we can create jobs and create things like that. National transportation system. You know, we don't have any of these things on the agenda. It's all about, you know, carbon tax, you know, modicums of things here, the green economy, the green jobs. You know what that means. You're going to go spend more than a whole paycheck at Whole Foods, right? In a sense, right? Yeah, in some ways. So, I mean, these are very, very important things to keep in mind. Okay, let me just go through a few little other things here. What is left unthought of is Freud, is the institutionalization, bottom of page 204. And I think this is very important because you raise a very good point. Excuse me. Okay, we'll see you, okay. Fusus nomos, right, as an opposition is playing out, right, but Freud refuses to see the nomos of this as Ricoeur sees it. What is left unsaid in infantile sexualities is a lot about nature and desire, but not the institutionalization, right? And this is important. The fact of institutionalization itself, right? Right? Okay? He lifts a corner, the footnote, I just want to read, this is interesting. Lifts a corner, footnote 48 on page 204, lifts a corner of the veil when he admits that taboo is not a neurosis, but a social institution, a Bildung. And those of you, the German Bildung means image formation or cultural formation, right? And the fact which is characteristic of the neurosis is the preponderance of the sexual over the social instinctual elements. The preponderance of the sexual over the social institutional elements. But he immediately goes on to say that the corresponding cultural formation, on the other hand, are based upon social instincts originating from the combination of egoistic and erotic elements. The difference comes up again in another matter, the neurotic, in subjection to the pleasure principle, which is interesting. The neurotic is in subjection to the pleasure principle, flees reality, because most people say, oh, they're neurotic, they're not getting any pleasure principle, right, so to speak. But anyway, flees reality, which he finds unsatisfying, but one of the fundamental characteristics of the real world from which the neurotic withdraws and excludes itself is the factor of the human society and the institutions collectively created by it. How does it happen that the social creation and its resultant institutions are connected with the reality principle rather than with the pleasure principle? This is the question that remains unanswered in Totem and Taboo. So this is important to keep in mind, you know, in terms of the metapsychological work. Okay, so the last essay, The Theory of Autism, Fraser and Wilhelm Wundt, psychologist, German psychologist, Freud, page 205, derives the conviction that the social function of taboo depends upon the religious function of totemism. That the law of exogamy originates from the totem kinships, although this thesis was subject to much hesitation and charges of opinion on the part of Fraser himself, and went against the general tendency of ethnologists to dissociate totemism and exogamy. According to Freud, the savage belief in actual descent from the totem is the reason why we must not kill the totem. So the father, you descend from that. Old father time. You can hear this play out in many popular cultures, you know, elements, right? Or marry women of the same group, the incest prohibition, and also the development of clan society. We recognize here the two major prohibitions of the Oedipus complex. All that remains is to discover the father figure in the totem in order to secure the historical origin of the Oedipus complex. This link is supplied by psychoanalysis. It's a very original interpretation, again. This is why I'm reading it out loud. It's supplied by psychoanalysis itself. The case of little Hans. And I'll do this. So you have your hand, right? The 5 case histories, right? The little finger is little Hans, right? The middle finger is the judge, bounded by the rat man and the wolf man and Dora the thumb. The unconscious is to be thought between Dora, right, and the judge, right? Judge Schraber, the classic study in paranoia, thought he was being penetrated by the rays of the sun, etc. Nietzsche, by the way, went to his father's school, the Judge Schraber school, father's school, Daniel Paul Schraber. And anyway, and little Hans was the phobia of a young boy, right? That jumped into Freud's lap, which kind of justified transference. You know the story, little Hans? These are the 5 beautifully written case histories. He blew Dora. There's a lot of literature about this and the analysis of the hysteric, right? Although Lacan, in the work Feminine Sexuality, defends Freud against the detractors, but I think he's probably wrong. But anyway, we can talk about that when we get to Lacan. Anyway, the case of, and the patient of Ferenczi's convinced Freud that the father is the mass theme of an animal phobia in childhood. The new fact we have learned from an analysis of little Hans, a fact with an important bearing on totemism, is that in such circumstances children displace some of their feelings from their father onto an animal, right? And this is Ferenczi's contribution, The Dissolution of the Oedipus Complex, 1924. Sándor Ferenczi was Freud's, considered him his son, very, very close with Sándor Ferenczi, the Hungarian. Deciphered in infantile neurosis, this displacement of the father theme onto an animal figure will henceforth be seen or serve as the guiding thread in a labyrinth of ethnological explanation. Freud is also encouraged in this direction by the parallel already stressed between the savage's emotional ambivalence towards taboo and the ambivalence of the child's relations to his father. The displacement onto the animal figure being the unsuccessful solution of that ambivalence. All that remains is to find a historical equivalent of the fantasy displacement seen in the case of little Hans. What this case presents is in small letters now must be found written in the large letters of prehistory. The discovery of the father complex and animal phobias would seem to be what led Freud to combine 2 decisive and quite venturesome features. For the primary nucleus of the totem theory, the Fraser-Wundt nucleus. Wilhelm Wundt, by the way, was one of the fathers of modern psychology, German psychologist. From Darwin and Atkinson, he takes over a theory of the primal horde, right, according to which the jealousy of the male is alleged to play the role of excluding the young male from sharing the females whom the leader wishes to monopolize. This is going back to the father and the killing of the father. Although it is not clear, at least in Darwin, just how force is transformed into right and jealousy into the law of exogeny. Even more important, and this is, Freud read Robinson Smith very carefully. The theory he takes from Robinson Smith, the author of Religion of the Semites, his theory of the totem meal will enable Freud to patch up holes, and we're going to use this in our course, Food as Thought. That's going to be our restaurant project, Food as Thought, right? It plays the same part in all religions, that it is always an active commensal fellowship between the deity and his worshippers, that the oldest form of sacrifice is the sacrifice of animals, right? That the slaughter of a victim is permissible for the clan, but illegal for the individual. And finally, the sacrificial animal is, I'm talking about our food as thought, blood sacrifice, is animal sacrifice, yeah, but that's blood led, yeah. Would furnish the ethnological proof, ever elusive, of the famous totemic kinship. To this schema, already simplified, there must be added a few probable features. The totem animal was cruelly slaughtered, devoured raw, then lamented and bewailed as a prelude to the festive rejoicing. The material's been gathered together, and you see Freud in his collective work. One day the brothers, and Chris should be here, have been driven out, came together, killed and devoured their father. This is the beginning of the brotherhood, and so made an end to the patriarchal horde, right? United. And we don't study the brotherhood, we study always the patriarchy. You know, the brotherhood becomes part of a patriarchal moment, but we don't really study the brotherhood, you know. Yeah. Until united, they had the courage to do and succeeded in do what was impossible for them individually. Some cultural advance, perhaps command over some new weapon, had given them a sense of superior strength. Cannibal savages, as they were, it goes without saying that they ate their victim as well as killing them, right? The violent primal father, and those of you know the movie Weekend, you see the killing of the husband and they're preparing the food, Jean-Luc Godard, and he's flashing across the screen, totem and taboo, totem and taboo. You know, it's a very interesting, 1968 Weekend, which was considered a confused film. Not confused at all, but anyway, imaginative. The violent primal father had doubtless been the feared and envied model of each one of the company of brothers, and in the act of devouring him, they accomplished their identification with him, and each one of them acquired a portion of his strength. The totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, thus would be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed. You know, as Brecht once said, it's more criminal to found a bank than it is to rob one.
I agree.
Yes, indeed.
Obviously.
Which was that's what we should really be doing. Yeah. That and the therapeutic care, right together. Yeah. Put your money in, we'll give you a lot of good therapeutic care. I still think of slogans around that, right? The totem meal, which is perhaps the earliest way, would be a repetition and commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things. And this is Freud speaking of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. It is difficult to resist the impression that the Oedipus complex, deciphered in dreams and in the neuroses, is what enabled Freud to select from the available ethnological materials just those factors that allow for the reconstruction of a collective Oedipus complex of mankind in the sense of an actual event that occurred in the beginning of history. Identification with the totem and ambivalence in its regard are reified, so to speak, in now what is a literal and not a symbolic interpretation. If the dreaded animal and animal phobia, right, stands for the father, the ethnological myth allows the father to be substituted for the animal. Thus, the symbolic displacement in the dreams and the neurosis is paralleled and counterbalanced by a real substitution, which is supposed to have taken place in history. All of we have done is taken its literal value and expression used by these people, which they have therefore been glad to keep in the background. Psychoanalysis, on the contrary, leads us to put special stress upon the same point and take it as the starting point as our attempt to explain totemism. Okay, let me just finish real quickly and then we'll go back. The psychoanalytic interpretation of the Oedipus complex is thus extended into a realistic archaeology. It preens itself on being a literal interpretation of totemism. The meaning of the Oedipus complex, deciphered in the semi-transparency of dreams and the neurosis, solidifies into a real equivalence. The totem is the father was killed and eaten, the brothers never got over their remorse for the deed. To reconcile with themselves with the father and with themselves, they invented morality, the incest, prohibition. We now have a real event in place of a fantasy. Upon this first stone, it is possible to erect all the other conflict situations which hitherto were only deciphered. Unfortunately, the truth is that the primal parasite is merely an event constructed out of ethnological scraps on the pattern of the fantasy deciphered by analysis. Taken as a scientific model or document, totem and taboo is simply a huge vicious circle in which an analyst fantasy responds to the analysons. Okay, so Ricoeur has his criticism here. This is not a scientific document. But thinking about this in the realm of the imagination, a lot of it makes sense. Where do these laws come from? What is Nietzsche really talking about in terms of the second essay of the genealogy of morals? How does this moral imperative come about? How does the law and the prohibition against incest take its moment? The laws against transgression, what is behind all of this. So this is a question we leave open. Consequently, one does psychoanalysis a service, this is Ricoeur, not by defending its scientific myth of science, but interpreting as a myth, right? And again, as I mentioned, myth literally from the Greek, muthine, means a beginning. You need a beginning, always. In a way, you need a myth, you need a hero, and you need a legend always to keep a discourse going, in my opinion, right? And anyway, at the end of Totem and Taboo, Freud thinks he can derive Greek tragedy from the historical totem meal. The truth of the matter is just the reverse. The Freudian myth is the positivist transposition in terms of the ethnography of the beginning of the 20th century of the tragic myths itself. By this positivist transposition, Freud believes he is prefacing the fantasies of his patients and of his self-analysis with a true history. But this rational fantasy of Freud the man, later adopted by his school, is comparable, and this is interesting, to Plato's construction in Book 4 of the Republic, where the philosopher sets out to read the small letters of the human soul, the hieroglyphics, if you will, with its three powers, in the large letters of the city with its three social classes. And you guys know, the soul, right? The purpose of the Republic is to ask the question, what is justice? And is justice possible, right? He puts this out and who's it for, and he goes through triadic structures through this, and you have the three-tiered class structure of the craftsmen, the guardians, right, and the philosopher kings, right? And this corresponds to the three aspects of the soul, which is also triadic, which is the appetitive, which you could read as the id, the spiritual, the spirited, which is the second level, which could be read as pretty much the superego, and then of course you have the rational part of the soul, which is that little part of the mind, according to Freud, the ego, right? So in the Platonic thing, you have the appetitive soul, the seat of desire, which corresponds to the lower class, if you will, the tradesmen, the craftspeople, the farmers, the yeomen laborers. The second tier, the spirited, which refers to the guardians of, the keep below, who are really ultimately police the city, etc., and are educated by the third tier, the rational soul, which corresponds, I think, very well to id, superego, and ego, in some ways, that tripartite did it. So, anyway, the same goes for the father and sons of the Darwinian horde, the primal horde. He deciphers the jealousy of the father and the violent birth of society. In the totem meal of Smith's hypothesis, he deciphers the ambivalence of love and hate, of destruction and participation, which animates the symbolism of the meal through to its most brutal cannibalistic expression. In the morning that precedes the festival, he deciphers object loss, the narrow door of every metamorphosis of love. In remorse and deferred obedience, he deciphers the transition to, I like this, deferred obedience. He deciphers, right, the transition to social organization through the double suffering arising from the crime and from renunciation. In short, by means of this new tragic myth, he interprets the whole of history as inheriting the crime. So we're not burdened by original sin, we're burdened by, quote unquote, original violent crime. And again, another text I mentioned, I'm sorry my mind works this way sometimes, the footnote here is René Girard's The Violence and the Sacred, which is a reading of Totem and Taboo, called The Violence and the Sacred, René Girard. Society is now based in complicity in the common crime. Religion was based on the sense of guilt and the remorse attaching to it, while morality was based on the exigencies of the society and partly on the penance demanded by the sense of guilt. What is man? Nietzsche. Man is the animal that can make promises. How do you make promises? We have guilt. Right, in a way. Where does memory come from? Inscribed by the cruel mnemotechnics of this original crime. And this is where the beginning of the moral law comes from. Very subversive stuff here, in a way, in terms of the thinking. This new and apparently scientific myth breaks with any view of history, which would eliminate history from what Hegel called the work of the negative, sometimes translated as the labor of the negative. The ethical history of mankind is not the rationalization of utility, or use value for that matter, but the rationalization of an ambivalent crime, of a liberating crime, which at the same time remains the original wound. So in liberation, there is also wound, hence the use of the ambiguity of the French term again, blessure. You bleed, but at the same time it's a blessing, right? In many ways, yeah, the wound in the wound, leaving the wound open, the open wound, if you will, alongside the open hand. This is the meaning of the totem meal and the ambiguous celebration of mourning and festival. So anyway, the prohibition against fratricide and patricide, thus the brothers down through the page had no alternative. They lived together, but not perhaps until they had passed through many crises, to institute the law against incest, by which they all alike renounced the women whom they desired and who had been their chief motive for
It's the beginning of
dispensing.
democracy.
The beginning of democracy too, that's correct. The brotherhood
Yeah,
is the
it's the
beginning of democracy, exactly. So,
Are you reading for Totem and Taboo?
we're reading from the interpretation of totem and taboo. That's right. Yeah, and then Freud and the basic requisite, next page, of analytic explanation, which was the problem of figures as diverse as Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, Rousseau, and Hegel, namely the change from war to love. The question is whether this change still falls under an economics of desire. The whole problematic of the superego, which we are going to consider, centers on this point. The question no longer is the birth of the Oedipus Complex, but its dissolution in the building up of the superego. So I'll leave it at that. That's a lot to take in
Where's the
today.
comfort coffee?
And yeah. And you're going for coffee?
You want one?
I would love one, yeah.
Double espresso or you want?
Double is good.
Okay.
Yeah, double is
We'll be
always
right back.
good.
We'll be- I know the
So we'll
shortcuts.
we'll
Good.
start
Shortcuts.
with the notion of the superego, build on that, go back to interpretation of dreams, and also, I'll do a little presentation on that. And if you want to read, I'd say the first two lectures of the Lacan's four fundamental concepts. And I'll go back over what I did, in terms of, drive and demand, and how Lacan begins to elaborate these four fundamental concepts much differently than the tradition. You should have notes from the second or third session of this on Lacan's, four drives, the four fundamental concepts.
Oh, yeah.
I'll go back over those, okay? So, and I'll let you know, hopefully by Tuesday morning at the latest, whether we meet here again or at the People's Forum. I'm thinking they're going to accommodate us at the People's Forum, but of course that's my wish. And, it's not been
I
fulfilled.
didn't know
yet.
ahead of time if I don't have the key for the conference room.
What conference room?
There's a conference room.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
have the key.
Oh, you haven't stolen that
Nobody's
yet,
switching
Peter? I mean, what kind of Marxist
No,
are
I'm
you?
not going to partner
Well,
up
Michael,
here.
so I'll
Okay.
see you.
Okay.
I'm not gonna be here.
Oh, you're not? Okay,
I'm gonna be
I'll let
away.
you know. Okay, you're going
I'm going to
Vermont?
Vermont, yeah.
Okay, great, okay.